or ventral, and the posterior or dorsal nerve roots join immediately beyond the spinal ganglion to form the spinal nerve, which then divides into anterior, posterior, and visceral divisions. The anterior and posterior divisions proceed directly to the areas of distribution without further association with ganglion cells. The visceral distributions are distributed to the thoracic, abdominal, and pelvic viscera, to reach which they pass through the sympathetic trunk, and many of the fibers form arborizations around the ganglion cells of this trunk. Visceral branches are not given off from all the spinal nerves. They form two groups, that is, thoracolumbar from the first or second thoracic to the second or third lumbar nerves, and pelvic from the second and third or third and fourth sacral nerves. The brain. The brain is developed from the anterior end of the neural tube, which at an early period becomes expanded into three vesicles, the primary cerebral vesicles. These are marked off from each other by intervening constrictions and are named the forebrain or prosencephalon, the midbrain or mesencephalon, and the hindbrain or rhombencephalon, the last being continuous with the medulla spinalis. As the result of unequal growth of these different parts, three flexures are formed, and the embryonic brain becomes bent on itself in a somewhat zigzag fashion. The two earliest flexures are concave ventrally and are associated with corresponding flexures of the whole head. The first flexure appears in the region of the midbrain and is named the ventral cephalic flexure. By means of it, the forebrain is bent in a ventral direction around the anterior end of the notochord and foregut, with the result that the floor of the forebrain comes to lie almost parallel with that of the hindbrain. This flexure causes the midbrain to become for a time the most prominent part of the brain, since its dorsal surface corresponds with the convexity of the curve. The second bend appears at the junction of the hindbrain and medulla spinalis. This is termed the cervical flexure, and increases from the third to the end of the fifth week, when the hindbrain forms nearly a right angle with the medulla spinalis. After the fifth week, erection of the head takes place, and the cervical flexure diminishes and disappears. The third bend is named the pontine flexure, because it is found in the region of the future pons varioli. It differs from the other two in that A, its convexity is forward, and B, it does not affect the head. The lateral walls of the brain tube, like those of the medulla spinalis, are divided by internal furrows into alar, or dorsal and basal, or ventral laminae. The hindbrain, or rhombencephalon. The cavity of the hindbrain becomes the fourth ventricle. At the time when the ventral cephalic flexure makes its appearance, the length in the hindbrain exceeds the combined length of the other two vesicles. Immediately behind the midbrain, it exhibits a marked constriction, the isthmus rhombencephali, which is best seen when the brain is viewed from the dorsal aspect. From the isthmus, the anterior medullary velum and the superior peduncle of the cerebellum are formed. It is customary to divide the rest of the hindbrain into two parts, that is, an upper called the metencephalon and a lower, the myelencephalon. The cerebellum is developed by a thickening of the roof, and the pons by a thickening of the floor and lateral walls of the metencephalon. The floor and lateral walls of the myelencephalon are thickened to form the medulla oblongata. Its roof remains thin and, retaining to a great extent its epithelial nature, is expanded in a lateral direction. Later, by the growth and backward extension of the cerebellum, the roof is folded inward towards the cavity of the fourth ventricle. It assists in completing the dorsal wall of this cavity and is also invaginated to form the ependymal covering of its choroid plexuses. Above it is continuous with the posterior medullary velum, below with the obex and lingulae. The development of the medulla oblongata resembles that of the medulla spinalis, but at the same time exhibits one or two interesting modifications. On transverse section, the myelencephalon at an early stage is seen to consist of two lateral walls connected across the midline by floor and roof plates. Each lateral wall consists of an alar and a basal lamina, separated by an internal furrow, the remains of which are represented in the adult brain by the sulcus limitans and the rhomboid fossa. The contained cavity is more or less triangular in outline, the base being formed by the roof plate, which is thin and greatly expanded transversely. Pear-shaped neuroblasts are developed in the alar and basal lamina, and their narrow stalks are elongated to form the axis cylinder of the nerve fibers. Opposite the furrow, or boundary between the alar and basal lamina, a bundle of nerve fibers attaches itself to the outer surface of the alar lamina. This is named the tractus solitarius, and is formed by the sensory fibers of the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. It is the homologue of the oval bundle seen in the medulla spinalis, and like it, is developed by an ingrowth of fibers from the ganglia of the neural crest. At first, it is applied to the outer surface of the alar lamina, but it soon becomes buried owing to the growth over it of the neighboring parts. By the 5th week, the dorsal part of the alar lamina bends in a lateral direction along its entire length to form what is termed the rhombic lip. Within a few days, this lip becomes applied to and unites with the outer surface of the main part of the alar lamina, and so covers in the tractus solitarius and also the spinal root of the trigeminal nerve. The nodulus and flocculus of the cerebellum are developed from the rhombic lip. Neuroblasts accumulate in the mantle layer. Those in the basal lamina correspond with the cells in the anterior gray column of the medulla spinalis, and like them, give origin to motor nerve fibers. In the medulla oblongata they are, however, arranged in groups or nuclei instead of forming a continuous column. From the alar lamina and its rhombic lip, neuroblasts migrate into the basal lamina and become aggregated to form the olivary nuclei, while many send their axis cylinders through the floor plate to the opposite side and thus constitute the rudiment of the raphe of the medulla oblongata. By means of this thickening of the ventral portion, the motor nuclei are buried deeply in the interior and, in the adult, are found close to the rhomboid fossa. This is still further accentuated, a. by the development of the pyramids, which are formed about the 4th month by the downward growth of the motor fibrils from the cerebral cortex, and b. by the fibers which pass to and from the cerebellum. On the rhomboid fossa, a series of 6 temporary furrows appear. These are termed the rhombic grooves. They bear a definite relationship to certain of the cranial nerves. Thus, from before backward, the 1st and 2nd grooves overlie the nucleus of the trigeminal, the 3rd the nucleus of the facial, the 4th that of the abducent, the 5th that of the glossopharyngeal, and the 6th that of the vagus. The pons is developed from the ventrolateral wall of the metencephalon by a process similar to that which has been described for the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum is developed in the roof of the anterior part of the hindbrain. The alar lamina of this region become thickened to form 2 lateral plates, which soon fuse in the middle line and produce a thick lamina which roofs the upper part of the cavity of the hindbrain vesicle. This constitutes the rudiment of the cerebellum, the outer surface of which is originally smooth and convex. The fissures of the cerebellum appear first in the vermis and floccular region, and traces of them are found during the 3rd month. The fissures on the cerebellar hemispheres do not appear until the 5th month. The primitive fissures are not developed in the order of their relative size in the adult. Thus, the horizontal sulcus in the 5th month is merely a shallow groove. The best marked of the early fissures are a. the fissura prima between the developing culmen and declive, and b. the fissura secunda between the future pyramid and uvula. The flocculus and nodule are developed from the rhombic lip, and are therefore recognizable as separate portions over any of the other cerebellar lobules. The groove produced by the bending over the rhombic lip is here known as the floccular fissure. When the 2 lateral walls fuse, the right and left floccular fissures join in the middle line, and their central part becomes the post-nodular fissure. On the ventricular surface of the cerebellar lamina, a transverse furrow, the incisura fastigii, appears, and deepens to form the tent-like recess of the roof of the 4th ventricle. The rudiment of the cerebellum at first projects in a dorsal direction, but by the backward growth of the cerebrum, it is folded downward and somewhat flattened, and the thin roof plate of the 4th ventricle, originally continuous with the posterior border of the cerebellum, is projected inward towards the cavity of the ventricle. End of section 3.